Welcome to today's complimentary webinar, Top 10 Practices for a Successful LMS Replacement. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Spencer, and I will be your moderator for our session. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you a little about Brandon Hall Group. Brandon Hall Group was established in 1992 and was formerly Brandon Hall Research. As you may know, we are a research and analyst advisor firm. We have nearly 200,000 subscribers to our services and over 10,000 clients globally. Brandon Hall focuses on the areas of learning and development, talent management, leadership development, and executive management. We also specialize in sales effectiveness and marketing impact. We have several offerings for our members, including our Research Member Center, our Knowledge Bases, a Smart Choice certification program, and our Excellence Awards program. I would like to introduce today's presenters. Our first presenter is Stacey Harris. Stacey is the Vice President of Research and Advisory Services here at Brandon Hall Group. Our second presenter is Jason Marceau, the Vice President of Operations at Meridian. Jason is responsible for executive management and oversight of the software, research and development, technical delivery, and professional services divisions of Meridian. He also manages Meridian's strategic plan, overall financial control, and ongoing process improvements and business efficiency. Prior to joining Meridian in 2005, Jason held leadership roles with Quest Communications, where his teams were responsible for implementing telecommunications networks. I'd like to thank Meridian for sponsoring this webinar. Meridian provides the industry-leading Meridian Global LMS in an array of supporting professional services custom designed to align to unique client needs. They are the #1 ranked human capital management company for customer loyalty, with a documented customer retention rate of 98%. Their solutions empower organizations to optimize their learning technology, business processes, and drive breakthrough results. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you as attendees to take an active role in today's presentation. There will be poll questions throughout today's webinar, as well as a question and answer period near the close of our session. If you wish to ask a question during today's presentation, we would encourage you to do so. You may ask questions by typing in the question box of your control panel. I will be monitoring today's questions and will be providing some of your responses to today's presenters for their feedback as time permits. Also, a copy of the slide and recording of this presentation will be sent out to all attendees after this webinar. I'll now turn today's platform over to Brandon Hall Group's Stacey Harris, who will fill us in on today's agenda.
Thanks, Erin. Appreciate the introduction. And hello, everyone. Nice to see you on this kind of nippy day here in Ohio, as I said. It's a bit chilly out. Hopefully, wherever you're at, it's a little bit warmer. I see we've got people joining today from Fort Lauderdale. We have someone also joining from Ohio. Hopefully, you're a little bit more south and it's a little bit warmer. We have someone joining from Salt Lake City today. And we have a couple of Ohioans and a couple of Green Bay, Wisconsin. There we go. Lots of good places getting ready to head into winter here today. We did get a quick question about the 1-800 number, or about the phone call number. If you can't call in on the phone line, you can log in over voice over IP. Erin can send you some instructions on that. So thanks everyone for joining today. It's a great opportunity to have a good discussion about something I think is on a lot of people's minds, particularly as we head into fourth quarter and we move into the first quarter of next year. Lots of people are looking at their LMSs, if they're going to replace them, if they're not going to replace them, what are some of the challenges that they should be thinking about, and what are some of the opportunities. We have a great co-presenter here with me today, Jason, who has been really instrumental in helping multiple organizations, hundreds of them, make the change within their organization, and he's going to be sharing some on-the-ground tips and tricks that I think will be helpful for anybody, no matter what you're doing and what your plans are from a replacement perspective. We'll talk a little bit today about pitfalls and challenges. We know there's a lot of them and a lot of fear out there about replacing an LMS. I understand. As many of you know, used to work in learning functions that had LMSs, and we worked through the replacement process. In many cases, it's harder to replace than it is to actually put a new LMS in place. Replacement insights by industry. So we're going to be talking a little bit. Jason's going to be specifically sharing things like how replacement looks when you're talking about a financial or a healthcare or a high-tech or a transportation type industry, and then also based on the complexity, the size of an organization, their culture, their maturity. So we're going to be sort of covering both of those topics through some case study models, and that should really help you understand, if you're in any one of those industries or you have one of those challenges in your learning functions, how you might address some of them. We do have a nice summary of a top 10 elements of a solid replacement strategy, so we'll have a nice framework to wrap up the afternoon with, and then we'll definitely take questions this afternoon if you have any about replacement processes or tools or things that we've seen in the market today. So a good discussion. Please put your questions on the side of the Q&A box. We'll answer them as we can throughout the afternoon, and definitely we'll try and save time at the end for questions. So let's kick off today's conversation with polling question. This is one of my favorite ways to sort of start our agendas, because I think a lot of times organizations, when we're talking about challenges with replacing an LMS, they don't realize that in many cases sometimes the replacement process seems scary because of pitfalls that organizations faced in their first LMS implementation. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll and ask you to let us know, and we're making an assumption that you already have an LMS. If you don't, you may not be able to participate in this particular poll, but if you already have an LMS and you're looking at replacing, what was one of the worst pitfalls you faced in your original LMS implementation? Was the process for importing user data, that process that you had to think through and strategize through? Was it integrating those systems poorly? Did you not sort of connect those real tightly? Was it not engaging the user community? Did you find that really caused you some challenges with your current LMS? Or was it not setting clear cost expectations with the LMS provider? I think that oftentimes we sort of get into the middle of something and sort of these secret or hidden costs creep up. Or other, maybe we haven't mentioned something, and if there's an other, please put it in the Q&A box. Maybe we can address it a little bit throughout the event. Jason, just to sort of get you started on the conversation today, you work with a lot of organizations, some of them who are doing replacements, some who are going through their first time LMS implementation. Can you maybe share some of the larger frustrations that clients have come to you with through their replacement process that you find that they struggle with implementing new LMSs sometimes?
Absolutely. The first thing I would say is that the majority of the organizations that we deal with, if not all of them, that are in the replacement phase, really come forward with their lessons learned. And that's something to think about, which is if you're in the replacement phase, make sure that you are bringing those forward, because it does help a vendor understand where the pain points have been in the past, as well as a greater look inside the organization. So, as you can imagine, we've seen a whole range from, missed stakeholders, bad data imports, poor design approaches, but one that always tops the list is not considering the impact to end users, really from a change management perspective, because really, these users are going to be moving from something that they're comfortable with. Even if the system is not performing, there's still a level of expectation and comfort, and you can have a great platform, a great implementation, and those can all go well, but not thinking about the transition and change for the end user can really set you up for failure.
Yeah, those are all some challenges that I think we face. We've got some great ones that we've put over on the side here. We're going to give a few more minutes for people to vote. We've got just about 65%. There's some nice ones over here on the sides. We had someone comment that the LMS company was bought out twice soon after the implementation. So we're going to talk a little bit towards the end of today about mergers and acquisitions. We know it's a hot topic, especially in this market today. So we're going to share a little bit of insights, but maybe how you can address that here towards the end. Also, there's some questions here about the LMS pitfall could not do everything, so we wanted it to do, so they had to create workarounds. So there's a lot of organizations that face the need to create workarounds. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And then our LMS provider failed to deliver what they represented they would. That's always a tough one. Cross-platform compatibility was a challenge. And then there was the last one here, LMS was part of an enterprise system, no assessment of requirements, no customization. So that whole, not being able to sort of help you, really integrate it into your organization. I'm going to go ahead and close and share the findings. But 28% of you said other, so there are a lot of you who had some of these other challenges. 35% said integration systems poorly. 15% said process for importing user data. And then 20% said not engaging the user community. Only 3% said not setting clear cost expectations. I think that's one of those lessons that people have learned over time. So we're seeing less and less of that in the market today. So let's talk a little bit about, what it looks like when you're thinking about the pitfalls of LMS selection. And this is whether it's brand new or whether you are replacing it. One of the things that, a few of those categories fell into that we just talked about was not considering that entire learning ecosystem. So many of you had mentioned things like that, not being able, cross-compatible, not being able to integrate with systems. We know that about 32% of organizations in our LMS trend survey just of last year, which, by the way, we have a new one to open up right now, so if you're interested in participating in it, let us know at the end of the event. But the LMS Trend Survey just of last year said 32% of organizations marked more integration as one of their top reasons for replacing a current LMS. And oftentimes that doesn't mean everything has to be in a single system, but they definitely need to think about what that integration process looks like and how you connect the various systems. So looking at the LMS as a standalone system, not considering the integration points are always a challenge, not considering all the current tools you're using in the system, and not considering all the users. I know, Jason, you guys work extensively through integration discussions with a lot of your clients when you're working through this process. Do you have some insight on sort of the integration discussion and how difficult that is for a lot of organizations that work through it often?
Sure, and I think there's really two sides to look at. One is, what does that ecosystem look like, within the client's environment, and recognizing that it really is taking a holistic view and understanding of that with the vendor, because there's many systems that feed other systems upstream, and that's one thing I think that gets overlooked as well, that there's a direct connection into the system. There can generally be other systems that sit behind those and maybe source points for data. Aside from that, the other side is really looking at the system itself and saying how easy is this system going to be to integrate into all of our ecosystem. And that's one thing that Meridian really looks at from a design perspective, and we expose our entire business logic API layer so that we can connect really to any ecosystem, recognizing that there are some commonalities out there, but there are also some very unique challenges that allow us to easily plug into.
Yeah, and that actually probably fits along with one of the last comments that someone made to our last poll question, which was we didn't ask enough questions about the technical support, and it's killing us. I feel really bad because it sounds like can we get over some of these challenges? But we really can, I think, in the market. But I think she hit on, or he, I apologize, I don't have the name here right now, hit on one of the really important parts, which is not asking enough questions, and that's exactly why we're doing the webinar today. To just really get people to think a little bit more about the questions you have to ask. One of the other pitfalls of LMS selections often is not partnering with your LMS provider, and I think that starts with asking the right questions. It also starts with requiring that LMS provider to actually do some work up front. And I think oftentimes we as buyers, as practitioners in the market, are a little hesitant to request something of these solution providers. They really should be providing some upfront information about what they're doing, what their strategy is, what their roadmaps are, how they currently work with their current customers. We also oftentimes don't get very clearly defined who's going to be the project manager. We don't define the relationship manager or the executive sponsor, and that's often a really important component within that solution provider's system. And many times we don't actually talk to the solution provider or the LMS provider about their own experiences. How much have they worked with maybe a pharmaceutical-based organization, or organizations who have a lot of compliance, and are there lessons we can learn from them versus just trying to sort of put our old processes or our old way of thinking on top of that. And I think that's often something, again, we don't leverage those LMS providers enough. Now, Jason, you and I have had some conversation around this, because this is something you believe in pretty heartfelt, is that that dialogue up front is really important before you even begin to finalize the decision making or even the process for implementing a new LMS or replacing one.
Yeah, absolutely. And really that process doesn't start at the point of contract, but Meridian really looks from a mission standpoint of being that trusted advisor to prospects and existing clients, because we recognize that it's more than just the product as a platform. And while there's thought leadership there, as I mentioned before, it's looking holistically, but not just at that ecosystem, but at the organizational goals, and understanding that the platform's part of the solution, but you need to map business processes, the implementation approach. Is it a phased rollout? Are there different audiences? What does the integration points look like? What are end user adoption and change management? And these are all pieces that are very important to be a successful transition. And as I said, it really starts in that acquisition process, and there's really a responsibility when you use the word partnership on both sides, because many organizations may not know what questions to ask, and it's about a vendor being able to bring forward best practices and at least have ideas and thoughts to provoke that discussion.
Yeah, and I think those are good. Comments about sort of what the buyer should expect from their vendor as well. There were some good questions here about sort of channel partner relationships, and why don't we'll get into that a little bit later, I think, as you're talking through some of your case studies, and also what does a channel partner relationship should you expect out of that? So is that something, Jason, you'll be able to maybe address a little bit later, because someone had a couple questions about it?
Sure, absolutely.
So the other pitfall that we know is the one that really sort of, I think, hits home for most of us, especially those of us who have been inside corporations where you're face to face with people who are really frustrated, and there's no other way to put it. The instructional designers aren't able to get things done the way they want to. You might have unhappy and confused end users because they can't access information or leverage the tools within their workday the way they want to. Managers, the worst part is managers who just ignore things because they can't get to reports or information that is huge red flags for their user community. And probably one of the ones I think that many of us face, and I know I've personally had to deal with, is administrators unable to meet demands because expectations were set too high. Oftentimes there's this idea that the LMS is going to be a panacea, it's going to change everything, it's going to fix everything, when you might have some broken processes or tools or even approaches to learning. And so organizations, I think, struggle through this challenge. 27% of organizations marked ease of use and reporting features as one of their top reasons for replacing a current LMS. And I think that end user perspective is something we're going to talk quite a bit about today. But Jason, just sort of as a one comment on it, you worked with a lot of organizations about sort of looking at their end user needs. Do you have any guidance for organizations when they're trying to just identify who all their end users are? Is that a process that you guys go through on a regular basis with clients?
Absolutely. And this needs to start stating the obvious very early in the process. And what I mean by that is that when the organization is putting their business case together for change, because there's really two things to look at. One is who's using the system today, but it's also looking forward in terms of the organization's goals, because a lot of the times the answer will then lie there of who's going to be using it tomorrow. And that really needs to be considered in the transition. And that's part of the process that we go through, not only from the acquisition phase, but also within our workbook process, because it comes to a control gate really to refine and make sure that, while we're deploying the system today, what does tomorrow look like? Not only from a setup, but identifying those potential end users. And a good example may be, today we're addressing an internal audience. Tomorrow the business is going after a new audience, and this audience may be an external audience, whether it's somebody that's going to be paying to use the system or a nonprofit organization that's pushing out materials. But understanding that business need will very much help you capture those end users. And one of the things that we always recommend is making sure that you have end users, at least one or two embedded, within your project team as a power user, because it also gives you their point of view, and now you've established a champion in terms of the change management that's going to take place later on the project.
Yeah, and hopefully avoid a few faces that look like these on the screen here. But we had a couple of good questions come on the side, which is one of them is about sort of justifying the cost of a replacement LMS. And I think if you give us a few minutes, we're going to get to that topic when we talk about the LMS replacement process. And I do think there's some challenge around, sometimes because of the pitfalls we faced in the first LMS implementation, it makes it much harder for us to make the case for a new LMS, because people are like, well, that didn't go as well as we wanted, or things weren't quite as smooth as we wanted, or there's a challenge with where we're at today. Does it make sense to invest even more by getting a new system or another system, or even upgrading the one that we have? Well, we'll get to that, because I think there is some real solid business cases around that. Avoiding the pitfalls that we just talked about, though, there are some pretty good, I think, best practices, or if you want to call them just key practices, depending on the organization that you're in and your culture and your experience. One is obtaining provider experience and background. I think a lot of times organizations focus so much on those list of requirements and those RFP documents that kind of say all the different compliance and regulations that you want from a company, but they often don't actually talk to the solution provider about their background and about their experiences. And I think that's a really important dialogue to have. The other one is defining terms of agreements for project teams, not just terms of agreements as in cost and financials and compliance, but also what's that term of agreement look like from a project team perspective? Who will be working with you through this process, and what's their experience and what's their background, and how do you know that they're going to be able to, as Jason said, sort of bring forward ideas versus just sort of push something through and get it implemented in your organization. The third one there is leveraging end user use cases that look at the workflow within an organization. A lot of times organizations look just similarly at, oh, I need end users maybe to purchase for example, an e-commerce tool, but they haven't thought through that workflow of how that end user is going to get to that e-commerce tool. And so what does that look like, and what's the front end of that? Should that flow like? And then involving a selection governance group with diverse representation. Jason just mentioned this, really making sure you embed in that selection governance group not just key stakeholders and the people who understand the technology, but taking some of those end users and some of those people who maybe are even less interested in the topic and maybe even might be sort of belligerent or against the work that you're doing. Embedding them in your selection process might slow it down a little bit, but it will oftentimes make it better in the long run, and it's really important to think through that process. And then finally, negotiating integration efforts and costs. I can't emphasize this enough, which is that the LMS providers, and Jason's on the line, he could answer any questions that you might have, but there's a lot of room here to talk to them about what's important to you. And really understanding that negotiations are a win-win on both sides. It doesn't mean sort of telling the LMS provider what they absolutely have to do and putting them in a position where they can't accomplish what you're asking them to do, like one of the commentaries said earlier. But you really want to negotiate with the eye towards what's going to be beneficial for us as a company and how can we be a good partner to the LMS providers be a good partner to us. Jason, just along that last line there about negotiation, integration efforts, and cost, do you find that oftentimes when you're working with some of the organizations that that the negotiation process goes better when you think about it from a partnership perspective?
Absolutely. One of the things to recognize is that I think organizations in terms of vendors as well as companies that are using the systems want to move quickly through, and it's always the trade-off between how much level of detail do you need to be able to get a reasonable scope around it and move forward quickly, as opposed to getting hung up into a full-blown requirement session before contracts have even started. So, one of the things that we look at in terms of really partnering with organizations is recognizing that, we want to be able to get the right level of scope and making sure that the client understands the assumptions, but at the same time we build in, mutually, recognizing that there may be some unknowns and some things that we want to refine down. And that's part of the process that we work through very closely with our clients. And there's many times where we may come across something and it may change the direction a little bit, but instead of looking at just one piece, really looking at this client being with us for the long term, and generally that allows us to be in a position to move things forward, recognizing that we may have to step forward to help them out.
Yeah, and I think that's often those type of dialogues make the most valuable outcomes. Just jumping into now this question about what's your current concern. So if you are looking at replacing your current LMS, what is the concern that you have right now sitting in front of you that really you're worried about, the primary one? Is it moving content and courses? Is it communicating changes to your end users? Is it transferring that historical reporting data and where that might go to? Is it resetting up a structure and a domain information that you've spent maybe 2-3 years putting into your current LMS system? Or is it maybe an other? Is there something we haven't mentioned? And again, love to see your commentary on the side about things maybe that you're concerned about in replacing your current LMS, and that really is something you'd like to address maybe even here today if we can. Because I know these are really big challenges for a lot of organizations. While people are sort of filling this in, Jason, I mean, would you, just based on your work with your current clients, is there any one of these that you think that clients really struggle with sometimes when they're looking at replacing their LMS right now?
Absolutely, and the first one jumps out, and it's actually something we're going to talk about a little bit more in detail here later, but it's the content and courses. A lot of people, I think, the longer you've had a system, the more is there, and that can create a lot of risk to the project in terms of not understanding what the effort is to be able to move all that. It really is like moving your house. And if you've had that garage packed full for 4 years, are you going to move everything? Does it need to be cleaned up? What's going to get left behind? And not recognizing that very early on can create a lot of risk, again, to not only timeline, but to scope and budget as well, too.
Great. Well, and we have just about 56% of the votes. We're going to give a few more seconds, but I love some of the comments coming in. A lot of people saying want all the above. Understand that. We have to kind of pick a primary. That's the challenge with the polling system here, but understand completely. A couple people talking about establishing changes in business processes. That's a really good one. Business processes are really challenging when you've got to shift them. And then there's a couple people talking about reporting and metrics. That's a really big issue for them. Some about engaging in existing systems are sort of linear, so how do I make it more engaging in the new system? A lot of people talking about support systems. You know, Jason, this is a real, we'll talk a little bit about this, I think, later, but that support and having sort of been, you know, once bitten, twice shy, as someone put it, that, you know, they didn't get good support and now they want good support and we're not sure, can we get better than what we have? Is this sort of the industry norm, right? And then some people talking about afraid to sell the new company. Oh, there's a lot of good comments on here. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. Something about getting the LMS to talk with our student information system, so that's that integration issue against, right? We already have one integration working somewhat. Do we want to redo that integration process again? And I think those are all very valid comments. I'm going to go ahead and close the voting here and share what we've got also on our window. We have 27% said moving content courses. Obviously, the number one that you said, Jason, is the one that came up on top. 10% said communicating changes to the end users. 15% said transferring historical data, and 23% said resetting that structure and domain. Really big issue, structure and domain. So we're gonna, let's talk about some of these challenges, because I think a lot of times organizations really think, you know, it's sometimes, I think, almost unfair, because, you know, putting in a new LMS is sort of like working with a clean slate. You might have had courses, you might have material, maybe you were doing things with a manual process, but a new LMS, you sort of get that fresh, exciting opportunity. Replacing an LMS is often much more difficult, and definitely someone said it's harder to make the case for ROI for replacing an LMS, and I would agree with that. I've been in situations where I've had to make the case for replacing an LMS, and it is a much harder dialogue to have oftentimes. So the real first step for most organizations in the replacement process is the business case for change. And then we know organizations, once they've made that business case, once they've said, look, there's enough here that's not working, enough here that doesn't make sense, the relationship isn't working, they then have to identify what the change requirements are. So what is it that we are doing now, or we need now, or that we're going to need in the future that we don't already have in place or that we're already doing? And then there's that step where organizations go through building use cases and learning ecosystems, and this is that part where we talked about now, instead of just looking at the LMS as a single system, you have to really expand your view and think about what's all the places that I touch from a learning perspective, the evaluations, the outreach, maybe any social tools you might have, if you have any integration, as people said, with student systems or with tools that have to do with your HR or your customer systems, right? Understanding that learning ecosystem and all the touch points is a really big sort of mapping it out step for a lot of organizations. And then finally creating that RFP and RFI that it does have a lot about requirements and use cases, but also has a lot about the culture you're looking for. You now have learned so much about what type of a partner you want, and also is looking at things that are important for you down the road as well. Now, Jason, you and I had some conversation in this phase of the process. You said one of the things that you find can be helpful is sometimes actually early vendor engagement. Can you explain a little bit about that and how you've seen organizations sort of leverage that without sort of people sort of getting into a sales pitch yet, but sort of what that early vendor engagement could do for them?
Absolutely. You know, when an organization's getting ready to make that change, or they've made that decision to make the change, you know, there's a lot of information out there, you know, whether it is, you know, from the analysts, you know, lessons learned, other organizations they've talked to, but I wouldn't downplay, you know, the information that can come from vendors, and having, you know, a dialogue with them to understand to a greater detail, you know, what offerings and technologies are there. For example, you know, having an IT organization be able to speak to, you know, a vendor in terms of architecture and technology may provide a lot of insight into where things are at in terms of integrations and being able to achieve things. So that very much can set the right expectations, and at the same time give information back to these organizations to put the right amount of detail and information in the RFP so that they get back the information that they need to make the most informed decision across all of the vendor opportunities that are out there.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add to your comment is to let the solution provider know what stage that they're in, right? Don't you think that would be a real big positive, which is sort of saying, here's where we're at. We're at this front end part. We maybe want a half an hour of your time or 20 minutes of your time to really talk through this, but at this point we haven't even put out an RFP yet, right? Is that a good kind of just best practice from the vendor's perspective, Jason?
Absolutely, and we do this a lot with a lot of companies. And it helps that dialogue start early, but it is good to know where they're at in the process. And that's why I really kind of made the statement about once an organization has made that decision to move forward, and we recognize that many of them have to go through longer processes of information gathering than others, but we certainly want to help in any way that we can.
Once they do get to that RFP and RFI stage, then it doesn't stop there, right? So then becomes sort of this next stage of replacing an LMS, which is where organizations go through what we call sort of demo and use cases, right? So they actually get the vendors in now. They've sort of narrowed it down to a smaller set of solution providers, and they bring them in and say, okay, walk us through this demonstration or use cases and tools. They usually conduct some reference checks. I always recommend that you conduct reference checks with solution providers. I also recommend that they have some sort of a sandbox testing. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And then, as we said earlier, negotiate the transition terms, understand what that transition is going to look like, what your role in it is as a practitioner and as a buyer, and what the role of the solution provider is going to be, and who sort of owns what responsibilities. And we want to talk a little bit about this sandbox testing, because a lot of people don't realize that they can often sometimes get a sandbox, which basically a sandbox, for those who may not know what it is basically an environment that the solution provider will set up so you can go in and sort of test and play with the system and get a feel for how it works. You know, Jason, you and I have had some good conversations about this. It was sort of a good aha moment. You know, analysts are always saying, get sandboxes, do this very effectively, and the solution providers are often saying, oh, this is a bit of a headache for us. What's a good and realistic way to think about a sandbox process? Because we know that you can't do everything in a sandbox. A sandbox is just a testing environment. Can you give some guidance to end users on sort of how they should think about a sandbox that actually will be beneficial for them as well as for you as the solution provider?
Absolutely. And Stacey, you hit the nail on the head when you said, you know, expectations and being realistic, because that's what it's about with a sandbox. You know, a sandbox access is typically, you know, made available with default configurations. And with that being said, they haven't been mapped to an organization's business process yet. At the same time, you know, as a system that has more feature sets and greater levels of configurability, they're going to have more configuration settings. So trying to achieve a complex scenario in a sandbox, not having, you know, any training or background at that point, could prove to be frustrating. So that's why it's really you know, important to understand again what can and can't be done. So I would leave really with three things here. Is one, you know, understand and ask the vendor and have a conversation of what you can do and what you can't do, so that you do have an understanding. And then second, you know, use straightforward scenarios in that sandbox to really get a feel of the system. And then lastly, you know, save some of the more complex scenarios for the on-site demonstration, which is always good to see, you know, how is the vendor going to be able to solve my business challenge in this area with the system.
Great feedback, and I think it's also good for end users. I've had the experience where I've seen organizations sort of take a sandbox test, they had some troubles with it, and they may have discounted a really good organization they were working with because the sandbox didn't go quite the way they wanted it to. So I think really understanding how you're going to use that sandbox will save a lot of trouble and headache down the road. Great commentary there. Finally, this last stage, I think this is really important, because a lot of times people think, oh, I've signed the deal, I'm done, I can go take a vacation, right? No, let me just tell you, for anybody who has implemented an LMS, you know this is not the case, right? So for replacing an LMS, I think it's even more difficult sometimes on this phase of the project. The first is that development of a transition plan. This is a really important component, that you do have a plan, that you know what's going to happen in 60, 80, 100 days, and you understand each step and who owns that step, right? There's also a lot of work that has to be done around integration efforts, especially if you had integrations in the old system and you want to put them in the new system, and if you have new integrations you now want to create with the new system. So integration efforts usually tend to take a considerable amount of time. There is a lot of work. You know, Jason said that idea of sort of I've had this garage and it's filled to the top of moving current content and records. And then finally, what does the end user communication look like? A lot of people said we need to engage our audience. We need to help them understand it's not linear anymore. We need to help them understand the new tools. Jason, can you speak just a little bit about those last two? Because I think those last two are really important issues, that cleanup of projects, and maybe a little bit about the end user communication piece.
Absolutely. In terms of cleanup projects, that's what I mentioned previously around content and data migration records. So what we've found is that some organizations have been very surprised, meaning they've gotten into a project timeline, and this is in their first LMS before coming to Meridian, and ultimately they found that they have large data sets that they want to move into the system, and come to find out that they've got erroneous records, formatting problems from their source systems, and it becomes a much bigger project all of a sudden because they have to go upstream to fix these, as well as clean the data up and map it to the templates. Same with content too, which is especially now with mobile and organizations that may have mobile strategies of what content's going to get moved forward. And these can actually spawn off entirely other projects that are equal in size depending on the organization. So it's something really to just, again, make sure that the scope and the size and the effort there is understood, I would say, even within that business case, because you may very well have competing resources that need to be able to implement the LMS as well as migrate this content. The other thing that I would say there is that also ask the vendor too of what's involved in their migration process, because mapping it to a data template and loading it in is the easy part. It's everything that transpires before that, and are they going to help you with that process? Is there going to be guidance in terms of record fallout and collection, or are you left on your own to do that? So that's one thing that I would always scrutinize and make sure that there's an expectation. Many organizations have that experience in-house, others don't and need the help. On to the second point, about end-user communication, it really is about having a communication and marketing plan established early. I know we touched on having some power users and champions being embedded into the project. Obviously that's great, but it's really a larger change management plan in terms of how are those users going to be trained, how are they going to be brought up to speed on the system, and is the system going to be rolled out in terms of a big bang to them, or is it going to be more of a phased approach? All this needs to be thought about in terms of change management, but also that communication and marketing out to the end users.
Sorry, talking on mute. I think these are all things where organizations oftentimes forget when they're looking at all the cool new features and functions of a technology. These are sometimes the most important elements. We have just about 20 minutes left, 30 minutes left today, and so we do want to take some time now to walk through actually 5 case studies, Jason, that you've brought of organizations that have done replacements. They've been in various industries and in various complexities of the learning process, and we really want to understand what are these organizations what did they go through? What's the stories that you have to tell about them that maybe might help the people here on the conference line understand for themselves? So we're going to start off with the very first case study that you have around a public sector organization. So I'll let you take it from here, Jason, and talk a little bit about what story this case study has to tell and what you think some are the lessons learned from it.
Sure, absolutely. So this organization has about 41,000 employees that are dispersed across the country. So they were faced with many challenges from their legacy system, which was, one, how do we get all of our course and course information out to all of these remote locations, and at the same time, faced with what a lot of the government, as well as state and local government as well too, meaning tighter budgets, but having to really still achieve their mission and doing more with less. So they came to Meridian, and it was really the discovery process, right, to understand those immediate goals of what they were trying to achieve, but also then looking out in years 2 and 3 so that we could really set up a plan for them to achieve that, and at the same time taking into account those yearly goals that are going to be out there. And ultimately, what it resulted in was a combination of the Meridian LMS as well as an LCMS to meet their learning and content development requirements. And once that platform was in and consolidated their training, it obviously gave them the ability to then push out their courses to these remote locations and end users. But also, too, and this is really where they found their return on the investment, once those processes had been streamlined, it gave them the ability to then change their life cycle in terms of their courseware development. And that ultimately became that ROI for them to go in and say, we've now paid for the solution, but at the same time, we're now able to deploy content quicker, and that comes back to supporting their case, their business case, I should say. And they went through several phases. Like I said, that phase one was deploying the system and being able to then streamline their content. And then from there, they looked at saying, what systems are now integrated into the LMS and where can we gain efficiencies there. So they continued to build onto that, and it became a real building block type process in terms of, taking older systems and closing those operations out for there and bringing them up underneath one roof. And that's one thing that we're seeing a lot of in terms of the replacement phase, is that organizations that have multiple disparate systems being able to collapse down onto one platform now because the technology has advanced to be able to provide them what they need. So I think this is a great example of where Meridian and this agency came together, with an understanding of what their objectives were and be able to structure, a plan out over several years to achieve this, both from a technology standpoint, but also from a budget standpoint.
Well, and I think what's so good about, I think some of the big lessons there you just talked about, Jason, were one, that this took some time, but they didn't have to do it overnight, so that was a big thing. And then two, they definitely looked at the whole ecosystem. There was no doubt there that it sounds like they really took a good look at everything they were doing, and that sort of drove some of their decision making.
Absolutely.
Your second case study was around an extended enterprise. So this was going outside the organization's current employees and to an extended audience. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this in the CPA organization?
Absolutely. So, this is an organization that dealt with an extended enterprise, as you mentioned, and their legacy system was just buckling really under the performance needs, especially, given that a lot of their usage was seasonable. So there's times towards the end of the year where continuing education was needed, and there was just great impacts. And when you're thinking about an organization that has an extended community, it's a little bit of a paradigm shift in terms of what the traditional LMS model is, in the context that it's now a revenue generating model. And if a user comes in and experiences slowness in the system, first, that organization is now at risk of that user not continuing or purchasing that course, but also going and purchasing content or other offerings through competitive systems because they have a choice out there in the marketplace. So as you can imagine, the scalability and performance here was their number one thing, as well as marketing features that existed in the system. So as part of the transition effort, and going in and understanding this, because Meridian from a strategic standpoint is really focused on the extended enterprise and understanding these challenges. One from a scalability and performance standpoint, but two from a feature set, meaning we've built in certain features like time subscriptions, bundles that allow content to be bundled together and be sold, content ratings, and several other things that help the marketability, such as an e-commerce tool. So as we were going down the road with them, it really was also a very time-sensitive swap out in terms of at any point in time of moving this system, it needed to be seamless because they did not need any impact to revenue. And obviously there was a very critical window where they had the lowest usage that we could swap this system out. So it very much was an effort that had to be planned in what I consider of a kind of a hot swap capacity, which is get everything ready to go on a parallel track, and then switch the systems over. Obviously there was a lot of effort that had been taken from behind the scenes in terms of pilot testing and scalability and performance testing to ensure that the solution that was going to be turned on was going to be successful. And ultimately that's the track that we took with them. And they really had some phenomenal results though once they got a system that allowed them to scale. And for example, during their peak season, they were recording almost 600 online course completions an hour and hit a target of 500,000 completions in the first year. So you can imagine, tied back to their goals, that was almost a 50% increase in revenue. So it was very much a success for them, but also recognizing this from an LMS vendor standpoint. When an organization is dealing with revenue streams, it takes on a whole different perspective than just some of the internal corporate systems that are deployed.
And Jason, we got a good question on the side over here. I don't know if it's particularly in relation to this, but I think that depending on noticing how complex this particular case study was, someone asked a question that they felt like they didn't get enough time with their first vendor to really get to know them. They didn't even come on site, and they wanted to know, and they only got a few hours of training in their process, and I was being the administrative side of it. Can you just give an idea for this particular case study, maybe the last one, how much time did you find you spent with these clients up front, particularly in the training and in the preparation for each of these clients, to give someone an idea of what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. And really, Stacey, as I mentioned, it really starts before that with Meridian. We have what we call the acquisition phase, which is obviously the procurement cycle where our sales teams are involved. But we recognize that this is also the point in time where bringing forward members from our delivery organization and being involved in that acquisition is critical for both sides. One, from a client perspective, they get to, or prospective client, they get to ask questions of technical resources as well as project team resources to make sure they're considering everything, as well as it helps us understand and better identify what the scope is. And what we tend to find is that when that connection is made, it's mitigated the risk of the old sales handover across the fence to an organization that has no idea what has been taking place, because they've been involved. They understand the business already. They understand the scope. And at that point, it really becomes a refinement. So I would say, that procurement cycle, our delivery teams are already involved. But then actual time, once that's taken place, is that we have a process that we call decision point training, and it really is a level set, recognizing that most stakeholders at this point have used other systems. Some may have never used an LMS, but it's the point that we want to make sure that everybody understands what the considerations are that need to be made going forward, what can be configured, and just get used to the system overall, so that moving forward into the analysis and design, there's a level set that's taking place. And we come on site, and that's typically 1 to 2 days. And then in support of that, it transitions into what we call our workbook session, which is configuration and setup of the system, from domains to organization structure, but also is there any other type of discovery that needs to occur and refinement, around integration points or potential modifications of the system that are needed. And that can range anywhere from 3 to 5 days as well.
It's a great sort of insight as to sort of the length that organizations might want to think about spending with their vendor at the very least. And I would agree that a couple hours of training is definitely not enough. Even if you've got a small business that you're running, you should at least have a day or two of time with that solution provider. The third case study you have here is about a transportation organization, a railroad actually, right? And they had internal and contractor staff, which I thought was sort of an interesting case study. You want to talk a little bit about this, Jason, just to keep in mind we have just about 10 minutes left. So.
Yep, and for time's sake, kind of summarize here is that, being a railway, they had extreme government oversight, so compliance and regulatory guidelines here are absolutely critical. And really there's two sides of it. One, just enormous fines for being out of compliance, and the second part is people's lives really being at stake, because if someone is not qualified to operate a certain level of equipment, it can bring both of those into fold very quickly. So this organization had multiple systems, and ultimately those systems contained about 10 million user records. So the data and accuracy of that data, as well as getting it moved into one platform, I would say was the really big challenge here. So Meridian has a process, and I won't get into the detail. We're happy to talk to anybody about that, about how do you move record sets of that magnitude while maintaining accuracy. Requires several quality gates in an approach to make sure that ultimately we got that data into that system very quickly in the event that records needed to be pulled out of the system and people's training records analyzed in terms of compliance, if they've completed training or they're qualified to operate certain rail equipment.
And there's a question here, and I don't know if you can address this now, or maybe if we have a case study, we'll get to this, Jason, because this is definitely high compliance, high complex organization, but many times small businesses are just as highly regulated in compliance. There's a question here about someone saying that they were a small organization, and they're worried about sort of being swept under the, aside in lieu of the bigger clients for a lot of organizations. Can you maybe address a little bit how you guys handle, and how you think that the market is handling small businesses versus sort of the larger organizations like this that have very similar complexities, if not the same size of company use?
That's a fantastic question, because one of the case studies down under financial, and I know we're pressed for time, so I'll kind of pull that one forward, which is that Meridian deals with organizations of all sizes, and the important takeaway is that what we find is that the problems that exist with the big companies exist with the small ones too. So it's recognizing that and being able to have a process that you can then scale and tailor to fit the size of the organization. So for example, the one that I was going to speak about from a financial standpoint, they were a 200-person company. They have the same problems as the organization with 100,000 employees. So the nice thing that we're able to bring is best practices for how these large organizations solve the challenge, and then really scale that process down so that really from a scope perspective, they're not getting collapsed under the weight of a large-scale process, but bringing that best practice and how to achieve that down to a smaller organization. So it's something we're very familiar with, and we're able to leverage that experience for clients of all sizes.
And Jason, I know that's a great answer. I think it got to the whole case study for the financial piece that we have pulled up here. Is there any other final comments here on this financial case study that you want to mention before maybe we head into the summary today?
Nope, I think that's actually a good point there in closing, is that just recognizing that the challenges that exist across all lines of business from a training perspective in many cases are very similar. Some organizations have unique challenges, but really it's that breadth of experience and depth that organizations have in solving those challenges that can be brought forward in best practices to help any organization of any size.
Great, and I think a lot of this we're gonna wrap up. We know you have a great case study here on healthcare, and there's a case study on high tech. We're gonna kind of wrap up with the summary, and then maybe we'll come back to those questions on those particular case studies. But you also have all the details here in the deck that everyone's going to get following the event. So let's jump to our replacement strategy framework, because we do want people to get a chance to see this, because this is a 10-point replacement strategy framework. And this is really, I think, a great way for organizations to sort of ensure that they're really stepping through all the things they should be thinking about when they're thinking about replacements. And particularly, I think, you've mentioned many of these challenges in your case studies, Jason. So the first one was that systems integration issue with internal and external clients, understanding logins and system APIs and clean data and competing data structures, right? And then there's things like structure and domain setup, content and data transfer, historical data transfer, globalization, security, reporting, administration change, end user change, and stakeholder change. If you can consider all 10 of these things, you're 75 to 80% of the way of having a much better implementation, and I think a much stronger replacement strategy for your organization. Jason, is there any one of these you'd like to maybe hone in on from a summary perspective that you think really is important that we haven't talked about yet, and maybe some of the case studies that we might have missed?
One of the things that we haven't talked about really is the administrator change. We've talked a lot about end user, which is very critical, but at the same time too, as part of that whole change management structure, making sure that the administrators are involved in that process early, because behind just learning the new system, it may change a lot of their business processes for how they do things today, and being able to uncover that very early is very beneficial to the project to understand, here's what we need to be able to support our business processes, and do those plug in, or do those need to change?
Yeah, I think oftentimes we overlook how important those administrator roles are within a process, and particularly when you had that healthcare example. I think administrators, when it comes to healthcare, any kind of compliance-driven organization, really play a major role, not only in sort of getting the word out to the end users, but making sure that the organization is compliant. So great commentary and feedback there. We do have multiple questions on the side of the thing, so I do want to maybe start to get to some questions. If you have questions that we haven't answered already, please feel free to put them in the list. We do have one last poll question, so we're going to go ahead and ask that, and then we'll go ahead and get to the questions here today. This last poll question really is about what your questions are today in the current LMS market, because Meridian's going to be doing three actually webinars with us going forward, and we want to make sure that some of the challenges that you're tackled with, they're actually covering in those webinars. So I'm going to open up this last poll for the audience. And this is just going to give you an opportunity to say what's really on your mind right now. What are some of the questions you have today Is it about the mergers and acquisition activity? Is it meeting the needs of the internal and external audiences? Is it the evolution and adoption of multiple delivery methods? Is it evolution from learning reporting to reporting and performance analytics? That means sort of like workforce management and workforce planning and how that's tying to the learning tools. Or is it this other component? Is it something that we haven't mentioned that you'd love to put over on the side? Please feel free to sort of add some commentary to that. And Jason, part of what you guys are trying to do with this series of webinars that we're doing is really share some of the experiences you guys have found over the last 20 years or so that you guys have been helping organizations implement LMSs, correct?
Absolutely.
We'll give everyone a few moments to vote on this. While we're finishing that up, Jason, I'm going to read off a couple of questions that people had from your last conversation. Someone said, from identifying vendor to implementation, how long should we plan for the transition? What things might add to that time? Can you maybe comment on that question while people are sort of finishing up answering this poll question for us?
Sure. Just to recap, were they asking about the timeline from the business case all the way through the project, or did you say vendor selection through the project?
From identifying the vendor to implementation? Yeah.
Okay. Sure. And really, depending on the size of the organization and complexity that may exist, what we typically see is about 12 weeks. And that can scale either down or up depending on what's going on. But as an average, that's typically what we see. And really what I mean by, complexity is some of the things that we touched on earlier, which is, are there parallel projects for, updating content for mobile strategies and things of that nature that are going to be running in parallel that may extend the project? Are they going to do pilot phases because of particular audiences that they want to slowly bring onto the new system? So lots of variables there. So hopefully that kind of at least sets, some level of average, but recognizing that many things can influence that. And that's why it's great, have those discussions early on, with the vendor and say, this is kind of what our scenario looks like. What do you think? Because you can get, pretty reasonable timelines back.
Yeah, no, those are great insight. And I think that the 6 to 12 weeks is about what we've seen on the research side as well. I think that's a reasonable time frame. And definitely for larger organizations that might extend out. If you've got a really strong group, has to have a lot of, I think, different opinions sort of shared, but I think it's real positive to sort of have a window that you're going to be working within so that it doesn't extend too long. Just real quickly, we are showing our poll comments. I think this is interesting. It's sort of 25, 25, 23, 23%. Almost all of you are sort of average on all the challenges. So I think, Jason, some of the topics you guys are planning on talking about in the next upcoming events are going to be pretty hot to everybody. We had some great commentaries also on the side about what people are looking to talk about going forward, which is identifying vendors. Or people said they answered 1 and 2 is equally important, and some people talked about integrating mobile learning within LMS and how to reach the emerging mobile audience. So a lot about mobile and social, which I think we'll be talking a little bit about maybe in one of the case studies that you guys have, Jason, as on the 4th event. Just to kind of wrap up today's event, if anybody has any questions that we haven't answered about sort of replacing the LMS, we've talked a lot, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to our sort of summary replacement strategy framework here. This is a really hot topic, but it's also, I think, something that's important to the market as a whole when we think about the fact that replacing an LMS really puts so much stress on those people who are doing that work. They really have to think a lot more about not only getting a new system, but now taking all of what they're doing currently and transferring it. I'm looking at some of the questions that we had here also on the side. The person who asked about the time, there was another person who asked about justifying the value of a replacement LMS. Jason, maybe you can answer a little bit of a question about that. Do you have any last-minute comments about how organizations have sort of justified that replacement, built a business case for that replacement strategy?
Sure, absolutely. One can be what is their cost savings in terms of maintenance as it relates to multiple systems if they have multiple systems. Also, too, what is it costing the organization in terms of trouble tickets and delay? I think that's one that is not always brought forward, but you can start to drill down and say how much resource time is being lost on a weekly or monthly basis because of a system that's underperforming, and what is that costing the organization? Also, too, are there risks in terms of a dated platform as it relates to technology and security, depending on what the organization does, and the data, that can be another area where there can be risk imposed. So I would look at it from multiple directions, meaning, one from, if there's synergies that are being gained, from systems or business processes, but also too, what kind of lost productivity and risk exists in terms of running a system that's old, and you'll find very quickly you start adding those up. More often than not, that becomes your ROI and develops your business case to be able to move past the CFO.
And I know we're just at the top of the hour, so we'll take one last question that we got here. One of the questions was about sort of the integration process. There was a couple of comments, and then there was one question about sort of how do we ensure that the system will talk to or will integrate effectively with the other systems that we have in our organization, particularly from a replacement perspective, Jason. What are some of the things that you usually work with clients on sort of making sure those integration efforts work? How are you able to make sure that works for organizations?
Sure. The first thing I would say is always make sure that the organization has their IT representation there, as well as a subject matter expert on whatever that integration point is. From our side, it's make sure that you understand how the architecture of that system is set up. As I said earlier, our business logic API layer is completely exposed. So we can basically plug in almost like you think when you travel internationally and have a universal adapter that will really allow you through web services to plug into any other system. And then go another step further, which is asking where they've done this before, and examples of what other systems they've integrated with can give you a real good feeling, especially bringing your IT folks in to kind of vet that technical conversation and understanding of can this be done, how is it done, and have you done it before?
Those are great. I know oftentimes we forget that we've got to partner with the IT group. Sometimes it seems like it feels easier to go around them a little bit, especially if you're going SaaS, but integrations is where you need that IT involvement and is really an important part of making that work. Well, we are at the top of the hour. We had some great commentary, wonderful feedback. I love the interaction today, so I do appreciate it. If you're interested in hearing a little bit more from the team at both Meridian and Brandon Hall about some of the things that we're seeing happening in the market around these extended audiences and around the analytics and learning organization, there are 2 upcoming webinars in October and November. And additionally, if you have any questions for myself or Jason directly, if you just we're very open to hearing any of your own questions about sort of what challenges you're facing, what things maybe we can answer for you. Please feel free to reach out to us directly. I'm always open to reaching out to people on LinkedIn, or feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And Jason, you've got your email and everything here as well. If you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer that you want to put on our evaluation, please feel free to fill out that evaluation. They are really important to us to make sure that we're providing educational sessions that add value to you every day, so that feedback we do take very seriously, and we try to continue to improve our webinar series. Jason, thank you for your time and great feedback and great insights on sort of what you're seeing today in the market, but also how you're seeing clients sort of overcome some of these challenges. Do you have any last-minute comments for everybody today?
Nope, just wanted to thank everybody for their time, and hopefully it's been informative. And as you said, if you've got any additional questions around challenges that they're facing in terms of putting together a business case or trying to move through that process, we're happy to have that conversation. So feel free to reach out to us.
Yep, definitely. And thanks everyone for attending today. Hopefully wherever you're at, it's not too terribly chilly, and winter's coming on with a nice soft sunshine in your back as it is here in Ohio. And we look forward to the next event. We get a chance to talk with everybody. If anybody's going to be at HR Tech in the upcoming couple of weeks, I will be there along with several representatives from Brandon Hall, so we'll be more than happy to maybe talk to anybody who's out there. Otherwise, we'll see everybody in the next event.